Back in 2020, when the whole world was hit by a pandemic, every medium of transport just shut down. Trains, planes and ships. Millions of Indians got stuck abroad. In response to all this, the Indian government launched the Vande Bharat Mission. The goal was to bring back Indians stranded in various countries. The mission was a huge success, and around 7.2 million Indians were brought back home. AirIndia played a significant role, operating nearly 200,000 flights to repatriate stranded citizens. Among these flights, one did not return safely. A terrible accident shattered this plane into pieces. Let's try to figure out what happened in today's video. On August 7, 2020, at Calicut International Airport in Kozhikode, Kerala, AirIndia Express Flight 1344 was preparing for departure to Dubai International Airport. The plane was piloted by 59-year-old Captain Deepak, who had 10,000 flight hours under his belt, and the first officer was Akhilesh Kumar, with 6,600 flight hours of experience. The captain had already landed at Calicut Airport 27 times before. Following the inspection, Flight 1344 departed. A few hours into the flight, it made its way over the sea and reached Dubai, where many Indians were waiting for this flight to return to India. All the passengers were headed to Calicut International Airport. The plane landed at Dubai International Airport, and about half an hour later, 184 passengers started boarding. While food and drinks were being loaded, the AirIndia pilots were informed that heavy rain was affecting Calicut Airport with worsening weather conditions. After the extreme heat of June and July, things in Kerala had changed so much that people had been dealing with heavy rain and flooding for days. Typically, when departing for an airport experiencing severe weather, additional fuel is loaded in case of a go-around or diversion to an alternate airport is necessary. Therefore, additional fuel was added to ensure operational flexibility. ATC cleared the flight and it took off around 4:20 p.m. After a few hours, it arrived at Calicut International Airport. Calicut International Airport has a single runway, measuring 9,383 feet in length, designated as runway 10 and 28. Due to steep drop-off at both ends, this type of runway is classified as a tabletop runway. AirIndia Flight 1344 arrived at Calicut at 7 p.m. as scheduled, but poor visibility due to a strong storm made it difficult for the pilots to see ahead. ATC cleared the aircraft to land on runway 10. That's when the captain noticed that one of the plane's windshield wipers wasn't working. With the wiper inoperative, water accumulated on the windshield, further reducing visibility. Instead of diverting, the captain proceeded with a landing attempt. However, the aircraft was too high on approach, prompting the captain to initiate a go-around. ATC instructed the crew to circle back and attempt a landing from the opposite direction on runway 28. So they gradually started flying around the city and headed back towards the runway. However, visibility continued to deteriorate. To safely land the plane in this kind of weather, they are equipped with an instrument landing system ILS on board. The crew initiated an instrument landing system approach, and the aircraft gradually descended 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. Despite descending, the aircraft was still too high above the runway. In the dark night and bad weather, it landed right in the middle of the runway. With insufficient runway remaining to stop, the aircraft overran and crashed into a ditch beyond the runway's end. Nearby locals rushed in to help rescue the passengers, and within minutes, firefighters arrived at the scene. Thankfully, there was no fire in the wreckage. Within about 3 hours of the incident, all the passengers were evacuated and sent to the hospital. Out of the 184 passengers on board, 19 lost their lives. All 4 flight attendants survived, but both pilots perished. The families of the deceased passengers will receive $11,000. For those under 12 years old, the compensation was $5,700. and for those in critical condition, it was $2,000. Those with minor injuries will get $570. The government will cover all medical expenses until everyone is fit again. This incident was one of the deadliest accidents of Air India, and there are many secrets surrounding it. Despite having the ILS, how the plane couldn't land safely. Even after 2 attempts, the pilot couldn't get it down correctly. The day after the incident, they sent both black boxes to extract the data. Meanwhile, an investigation team arrived at the crash site. The wreckage of the broken plane was saying a lot. Before impact, the aircraft spoilers were deployed. These are used during landing to reduce lift and prevent the aircraft from bouncing. This helps the aircraft stay firmly on the runway. And the deployed spoilers indicated that the pilots were committed to landing. But the throttle told a different story. It was in the toga position, which means take off and go around. This provides full power for takeoff. So the investigation team was confused about what the pilots were actually trying to do, land the plane or take off again. During questioning, ATC personnel stated that the fog was so dense they were unable to visually track the aircraft. However, the wind was blowing from behind the plane, which usually increases its speed and can make it a bit tricky to stop. But this wasn't such a big issue that it would lead to an accident. It took the investigation team about a year and a half to figure out what really caused the plane crash. When the report was finally released to the world, it was truly shocking. When the pilot couldn't land on the first attempt, they tried to circle the city and then align the plane to the runway again. The plane was on its glide and gradually dropped down to about 1,000 feet. At that point, the pilot turned off the autopilot. Even though the auto throttle was still on, normally this isn't done, especially on a stormy dark night when the pilots can't see anything ahead. In those situations, you rely on the instrument landing system to land the plane, and it only works if the autopilot is still on. But the captain turned off the autopilot. Maybe he was trying to take manual control of the plane. However, he should have also turned off the auto throttle because it adjusts engine power based on the autopilot's request. If the autopilot is increasing the plane's altitude, the engine needs more power. But who decides how much power and how it's applied? That's all handled by the auto throttle. Just imagine, Air India was landing on autopilot with the auto throttle engaged. It was reducing engine's power, and that's when the pilot turned off the autopilot. So the auto throttle was still trying to reduce the engine's power. But without the autopilot, the power kept decreasing. As a result, the plane descended below the glide slope. If it went above the glide slope, it would overshoot the runway and crash somewhere. If it dropped below the glide slope, it wouldn't even make it to the runway and would end up crashing. The first officer said, "Captain, we are going down." The captain replied, "Yes, yes," while alarms were blaring the cockpit. The captain slightly raised the nose of the plane to climb back into its glide slope. But there's a limit to do that. If the plane drops too far below the glide slope, just lifting the nose won't help. It'll end up going even higher than the glide slope. If you try to bring it down from there, it could again drop below the glide slope, making it really hard to get the plane back on track. This is especially tricky when the plane's altitude is low. Air India had dropped 500 feet below its glide slope, and here the captain made another mistake. They pushed the thrust lever up by 83%. Maybe they did that to lift the plane. Now the speed of the plane shot up so much that it couldn't land or take off. It was hovering above 20-30 feet above the runway. The plane even passed the touchdown point where it was supposed to land. The first officer kept saying, "Captain, pull down." But the captain stayed silent and didn't respond. The plane had gone so far down the runway that the first officer could clearly see the end of it. And beyond that, there was a ditch at the end. Realizing that a successful landing was unlikely, the first officer again urged, "Captain, go around." However, the captain did not respond. The plane landed about 4,438 feet past the touchdown point. They used maximum brakes and engaged reverse thrust. But just a few seconds later, the captain disengaged the reverse thrust. At this point, the captain may have been considering a go-around as he briefly released the maximum braking. Right after disengaging, the plane started picking up speed again. But to lift off the ground, the engine power needed to be increased, which the captain didn't did. He didn't boost the engine thrust and applied reverse thrust again. Right after that, maximum brakes were used. Maybe the captain thought the plane wouldn't reach the speed needed to take off again. So that's probably why he applied the brakes once more. He must have been panicking and couldn't figure out what to do in such a situation. Just seconds after hitting the brakes, the plane crashed into the ditch. What led the captain to handle the aircraft in such an erratic manner? To find out, the investigators searched his bag and found non-aviation anti-diabetic drugs. Now, what are these non-aviation drugs? Even when pilots are served food, the airline companies are very careful. Like both pilots can't eat at the same time and can't have the same meal for both pilots. The reason is if something goes wrong with the food, then both pilots are in trouble together. Just think about it. If the airline is so careful about the food, how much more attention do you think they pay to the medication? The side effect of meds can show up really quickly compared to food. That's why doctors always say to take medicine only after eating. To make sure nothing happens to the pilots, the aviation team decides which meds to give them and which don't. Air India's captain was on non-aviation drug, meaning the medications that the aviation team prohibited pilots from taking. All 4 flight crew survived. The investigation team questioned them, and that's when it discovered that the captain had hardly eaten. It turns out that if the captain's non-aviation antibiotics are taken with less food, it can lead to hypoglycemia. The investigation revealed that hypoglycemia can impair decision-making ability and reduce situational awareness. Maybe that's why the captain wasn't making the right decisions. Besides, the captain was on leave on August 7, but he still had to fly that day because only the captain was available who can take off and land at Calicut Airport. There were a lot of pilots available, but very few captains can fly here. Maybe that's why the captain was so stubborn to land. On top of that, they found something shocking about the behavior of both pilots. They weren't familiar with each other at all. The captain was always speaking loudly to the co-pilot, while the co-pilot was talking in a low voice. Whenever the first officer pointed out errors, the captain reportedly became irritated. He probably felt like the co-pilot was trying to teach him something. Attitude could be sensed from the way of talking of the captain, which is why the first officer often stayed quiet. Even when the captain made a wrong decision, the first officer didn't feel capable enough to go against the captain's decision. This was an avoidable incident that should never have occurred. People often talk about tabletop runways, that if there's a trench on both sides of the runway, why don't we just shut down the airport? If it's so dangerous, or at least close it during bad weather. This actually has a point. If that Air India flight had landed at Delhi International Airport instead of Calicut, we could have avoided this accident. But what can we do? We can't just shut down all tabletop runways to prevent these kind of incidents. The real danger isn't from tabletop runways, it's from making mistakes. For example, if the runway is 13,000 feet long and the pilot messed up flying the plane above its glide slope, even if we say it's at 1,000 or 2,000 feet, or it lands at 3,000 feet, it will still have such a long runway to stop, it will come to a halt easily. Even in the event of braking failure or reverse thrust malfunction, a long runway provides ample stopping distance. According to me, a long runway can forgive 1,000 mistakes from the pilot. But if any of those mistakes happen on a short runway, that too a tabletop runway, then it could lead to a crash. So the issue isn't really at the airport. The problem comes from making mistakes. If mistakes are avoided altogether, it doesn't matter if you're at Calicut International Airport or any other airport. It's all the same. That's why only experienced captains are allowed to take off and land at Calicut Airport to avoid any mistakes. But Air India's luck hasn't been great, it seems. That concludes today's video. If you liked the video, give it a like. If not, feel free to dislike. Either way, don't forget to subscribe to this channel because there's a lot to learn in this channel. So I will catch you in the next video. Until then, keep watching and keep learning.